All right, in this lesson, we're going to be breaking down how to analyze the data. So more specifically, we're going to talk about the data points that matter to you as a high ticket closer, the KPIs that are associated with each of those data points, and then how to actually improve those data points if you notice that they are low. All right, so we're going to start with discovery calls. So like we've talked about, it's unlikely that you'll be asked to take a discovery call, but just in case, these are the important metrics to know. Okay, so for a discovery call, you have your show rate. All right, now the KPI here is going to be anywhere from 50 to 60%. Now it's typically a little bit lower than the show rate KPI for a closing call, because there's an argument to say that if you're doing a 2-call close, lead quality might not be as high. And if lead quality is not as high, the likelihood of them showing is going to be a little bit lower. So I hold the standard that I hold for a discovery call is anywhere between 50 to 60% for the show rate there. Now, the next KPI for discovery calls is conversion rate. So conversion rate means what percentage of the calls that do show to your discovery call are getting converted to the next step, which is the closing call. All right, that's going to be 50%. Now, this is an indication of lead quality. So if it's below 50%, right, lead quality is likely going to be the issue there, which you as a high ticket closer, you could just provide that feedback, obviously, to your superior. There's not really like a lot. You're not in charge of the marketing, so there's not a lot directly that you could do there. But just know 50% is the number that we're aiming for there. And we also have to keep in mind, like, we're not passing everyone through, like I said, because of lead quality. There are going to be people that you turn away. All right, so that's all the metrics you need to know for discovery calls. Now we're moving into the metrics you need to know for closing calls, okay? So the first one here is calls scheduled, okay? So this is at the top of your funnel. So you have calls scheduled at the top of the funnel, right? Then you have calls shown, calls pitched, calls closed, right? So in theory, the more calls that you have on your schedule, the higher likelihood the rest of the data points will be higher as well. So more calls means you'll probably have a higher show percentage. You'll probably have a higher pitch percentage. You'll probably have a higher closing percentage because you have more opportunity, right? That's in theory. Now, this is the number of the calls you had on your calendar at the start of that particular day. So the definition of that data point is this, right? It's the number of calls you had on your calendar at the start of that day. So when you open up your phone, you look at your calendar, Google Calendar, whatever, right? You see you have 5 calls on your calendar. That means you have 5 calls scheduled. All right, let's move on. So the next data point that matters here is 24-hour turnaround time. All right, so here's how we track 24-hour turnaround time. So using the CRM, right, we're going to figure out, of the calls booked on your calendar, how many of those had a 24-hour turnaround time, right? So let's say you had 5 calls on your calendar, or let's just do a nice even number. Let's say you had 6 calls on your calendar. 3 of those were, turned over in a 24-hour turnaround time, right? That means you have a 50% 24-hour turnaround time. Now, this data point, what does it represent? It represents the specific 24-hour turnaround time of the calls that you had booked within a given time period. All right, so here's the equation to figure this out. Okay, now, do you need this equation? Maybe, right? But it's just good information for you to have, right? So the equation is 24-hour turnaround time divided by booked times 100 equals your 24-hour turnaround time percentage, right? So the number of calls that had a 24-hour turnaround time divided by the total amount of calls booked, right? So let's say you had 6 calls on your calendar, right? Let's say 3 of them, right, had 24-hour turnaround time. So I take 3 divided by 6, multiply that by 100, and that's going to give me a 50% 24-hour turnaround time, which is the KPI. So bare minimum, we want 50% of the calls that land on our calendar to have that 24-hour turnaround time. Why? Like we've talked about before, that's going to increase your show rate, right? Because a lot of these sales are emotionally driven. They walk up the stairs, they realize they're out of shape, they need to make a change, right? They have a bad month in business. Oh crap, I got to make a change. And a lot of these are emotions, and these emotions are fleeting. So that's why we want to capitalize on that with that 24-hour turnaround time, okay? So if this metric is low, right, I would have a conversation with the booking team or the person who books the calls and just say, hey, let's just make sure we're prioritizing booking the soonest possible availability. So when you guys are pitching calls for my calendar, just make sure you're pitching like the soonest possible call that is offered on my calendar, right? So that's one step you could take as a high ticket closer is you can have that conversation with the booking team there, right? Now, the second thing you could do as a high ticket closer is you can make sure that you have enough availability on your calendar to have these calls booked within a 24-hour window. Okay. So, like we talked about way back in an earlier module, the more availability you have and the more consistent availability you have, right, the higher percentage that you're going to be able to get these calls turned over within that 24-hour period. All right. So, this metric is extremely important, very important to your show rate. And obviously, if calls aren't showing, you're not going to close deals. So this is definitely one that you need to pay attention to. All right, the next one here is show rate. So how exactly do we track the show rate? Let's break that down. So this data point represents the number of calls booked that actually show up for their scheduled appointment, okay? So the equation here is we take the calls that actually did show and we divide that by how many calls were on the calendar for that day and we multiply it by 100, okay? So let's say we had 10 calls on the calendar that day. All right, and let's say 7 showed. So we take 7, divide it by 10, multiply it by 100, and that's going to equal our show rate. So in that example, it'd be 70%, right? Now, the KPI here. So this is for closing calls. So bare minimum standard, we want 60% show rate. All right, so we want a 60% show rate as the bare minimum standard. Now, if this metric is low, typically the biggest indicator is going to be we're not getting calls turned over in that 24 to 36 hour time frame. Okay, another question you should be asking yourself is, are you following the pre-call confirmation process? Are you actually the night before confirming your appointments and following that process all the way through? Right, another one would be, of the calls that don't show, like how good of a job are you doing following up with the leads that are in limbo, right? That's another thing to consider. Now, I did put a bonus training in here. These are 7 tips that we did to have a 70% plus show rate. So all you have to do, click this link. You guys can watch the extra bonus training that I made for you there. All right, the next metric that matters is calls offered, right? Also referred to as pitched. Calls pitched, calls offered, it's the same thing. So this data point represents the number of calls that get an offer when they show, right? So what percentage of calls when they show are actually getting an offer? And an offer means that we are presenting the price. We are presenting the investment. That's what an offer means, okay? Overall, this is a really good indicator of lead quality. Okay, so if your offer rate is low, your pitch percentage is low, once again, they're interchangeable. That typically means the quality of lead is not good because obviously you are denying them. You are not getting to the point of pitching them the price. So the equation for this is we take the total number of calls that were offered, divide it by the total number of calls that did show, multiply it by 100, and that is our pitch percentage or offer percentage. Now, we want this high, right? We want this around 90%, right? Obviously, there's going to be people that sneak through the process that aren't qualified, and that's what the 10% is for. But 90% of the time, we want to be setting ourselves up for success and pitching the program, right? We can't close a deal if we don't pitch, right? And once again, pitching means I'm pitching them the investment. I'm asking them to move forward with us. Can't close deals if we are not pitching offers. All right. Now, if this metric is low, typically if this metric is low, it's an indicator of poor leads getting booked for calls. This should be an indicator to you that you should have a discussion with the CEO or the sales manager to provide feedback. All right. One major caveat, and I've seen closers do this. This is an absolute no-no. This will get you fired. So no closer coming from the App First Closing Academy. I better not get any feedback that one of our closers did this, okay? This is an absolute no-no. Okay, do not do this. Offer rate being low could be because you purposely don't pitch calls unless you feel 110% that you will close them. This is usually because you want to inflate your closing percentage. This is a huge, huge no-no. So I've seen closers do this, right? Where if they don't feel with 110% certainty that they are going to close this deal, basically if they feel that this lead is a layup, they will pitch them. But if they don't feel it's a layup, they won't pitch them. Typically, these closers have low offer percentages, like 40, 50, 60%, right? And CEOs will catch on to that. And they'll be like, oh, you're only pitching calls that, are layup calls. And that's why your close rate is so inflated, right? That is an absolute no-no, right? Why? Because these companies are spending good top dollar to acquire these leads, right? And you should be, you are well equipped. You know how to handle objections. You know how to actually conduct a sales call, right? So even if you don't feel 110% great that you're going to close this lead, that you're going to close this deal, you should be pitching, because that gives you another opportunity to close the deal. Now, don't get mistaken. I'm not saying like you should only pitch. I'm not talking about lead quality, right? Of course, you should only pitch if you think it's a quality lead, and you should be not pitching them if they are not a quality lead. What I'm saying is, don't only pitch them if you think it's a layup, meaning like it's a guarantee that you're going to close the deal, right? Like like we want to give ourselves as many opportunities as possible. So even if we think like, hey, this is a good lead, we'll see where it goes, right? Like we still want to pitch those people. Hopefully I'm making sense there. All right. So the next metric that is important is your closing percentage. Okay. So this data point represents the number of calls that get closed relative to the ones that show. All right, so we are, the way that we do it is not pitch percentage. I believe I might go over that next, but we are going over close percentage. So close percentage is based off the calls that show. So even if we don't pitch them, if they showed, that's still going to affect our close rate. All right, so this is an indicator of the rate at which you close deals that show. Okay, so the equation here, we take the number of calls that closed, divide it by the number of calls that showed, multiply it by 100, and that's your closing percentage, okay? Now, KPI for this is going to be 30 to 35%, all right? Now, industry standard, a lot of people say it's 25%. I've raised the ceiling, I've raised the bar. I like to do for my closers that join my company 35%. 30 to 35% is the range that I am going to put here, okay? Let's keep rocking and rolling. So if this metric is low, there's a lot of things that go into it, right? Is your closing rate low because overall call volume is low? Often, if we don't have a lot of opportunities, the close rate can dip. For example, if you only have 5 calls and 2 of them close, that's a 20% close rate. I don't view that necessarily as a closing problem. I view that as like, there's not enough opportunities problem, okay? Now, another one is, are you properly pre-framing and vetting leads? Are you following the pre-call text protocol? Are you training and role-playing? Are you actually practicing your skill? That's like your biggest indication to your close rate. Are you watching consistent call recordings? Like, are you actually watching game film to improve? Are you setting yourself up for success by using and doing, Zoom calls, a sales presentation? Are you using the specific follow-up methods that we teach? Really, the biggest thing here is like, are you following the principles that we teach in the Act First Closing Academy? So if your close rate dips, obviously you can go back to the course, right? Review the fundamentals and make sure that you're following the process. Okay. The next metric that matters to you is contracted value. Okay, so let's talk about how to track this. All right, so this data point represents the total monetary volume value of the contract. In contract means it's set to be paid, but not all the cash has necessarily hit the bank yet. Simply, it's the total amount on all contracts signed within a given time period. All right. So for example, let's say the time period is the month. Okay. So let's say you signed 10 clients and the value of all those clients was $5,000, right? So that means you contracted. So the total amount of money written in contracts is $50,000. Okay, that's what contracted means. It doesn't mean the money that hit the bank account that month. It means the money that we have written in contract. Okay, so if this metric is low, if the contracted value is low, it's really only ever 2 reasons. Okay, reason 1, the volume of clients sold isn't high, meaning you aren't selling a lot of clients. The volume of clients is low, to which at that point you can look and see why. Is it because my close rate is low? Is it because my show rate is low? Or reason 2, the contract value or the average package isn't high, meaning that you're selling maybe like the downsell really often, right? So the total average package that you're selling is low, right? You're not selling the premium packages, okay? So the solution, personally, I would focus more on the average package sold, which is found by taking the total contracted for a time frame and dividing it by how many clients were sold. This could be increased by selling longer term packages and overall higher total packages. Okay. So in my opinion, if this was the case, I would focus more because it's more in your control, right? Like the amount of calls that get booked on your calendar will probably reflect how many clients you sell, and that's not directly in your control because you're likely not the one booking calls. However, what is in your control is the average package that you sell. So the average value of the package that you sell, right? So if you want to figure out what your average package is, right, you take the total amount of contracted value for a given time period and multiply it by how many clients you sold in the same time period, and that will tell you what your average package is, right? And then I would just focus on, hey, how can I get this number up? Do I need to sell more longer term packages? Do I need to sell more of our premium programs? And focus on why you're not selling more of those already. All right, another solution. Obviously, we are always trying to increase the total volume of clients sold, but if your total volume is low, it's either because your close rate is low, your show rate is low, or your bookings are low. And I would look into those three to make the adjustment accordingly. All right. Moving on here, okay? So how do we track the total amount of collected from contracted? So out of that contracted value and from that same time period, how much should we collect, okay? So this data point represents how much of the contracted value you collect in the first 30 days, okay? This value is extremely important to maintaining a healthy overall business margin and getting your commissions quickly. This metric is also really useful for scaling. The more cash you pull forward, the more you can spend on marketing month to month. Okay, so a couple different moving parts here, okay? So let's recap this, and then we'll talk about how this affects the business you work for and how this affects you. All right, so once again, of the amount you contracted, okay, so let's say in a month you contracted $50,000, okay? In that same month, how much did we collect? Meaning that cash actually hit the company's bank account, right? Let's just say it's 25%, right? That'd be a 50% cash collected. That's awesome. And we'll talk about KPIs in a second. But the reason this is so important is we've talked about this previously, but usually most companies will require a certain percentage of the contract collected in order for you to actually receive the commission. So if you have a high collected percentage, you're getting your commissions pretty quickly. Now, it's important for your company, the company, not your company, but the company you're working for, because if there's a high amount of collected, right, they're going to have a healthy business margin and they're going to be able to scale more, right? Because they're pulling more of that cash forward. They can take that cash to reinvest into the business, to reinvest into marketing, to bringing in more leads, which obviously if there's more leads, right, that's more beneficial for you, more opportunity for you. Okay, so let's talk about it a little bit more, right? So upfront cash collected, right? So once again, this data point represents of the contracted value, how much do you collect in the first 30 days, okay? So how we figure this out is we take the collected amount, divide it by the contracted amount, multiply it by 100, and that's your upfront cash percentage, okay? Now, the KPI here, 35% is going to be your bare minimum standard. Typically, this is the amount, 35% is typically the amount the company wants before giving you the commission. Now, if this metric is low, okay, the reason upfront cash collected is low is likely because of the way you structure your payment plans. You're probably defaulting to month, all right? So yeah, the biggest mistake closers make is they just go to the easiest, they just pitch the easiest payment plan because they know they're going to get the close. Well, guess what? There's some downside to that. Yes, you get the close, right? But now it might take a couple of months or yeah, a couple of months, maybe even longer for you to get your commission because you got such a small percentage collected, okay? Yeah, instead, what we want to do is you want to increase your amount of two pays. So splitting up payments into two payments, three payments, or you can even do that split pay in full that we talked about earlier, right? Which is use the pay in full amount, get half up front, and then get the second half in that 30 to 90 day range. All right, the other thing here is in addition to the above strategy, you can also make it default to collect 20 to 30% down and then move them into month to month, weekly, or bi-weekly. You can frame the upfront payment as a setup fee. Now, this is something you'd have to run by the company that you work for, right? But like you can make it your personal standard that you collect 20 to 30% down. And like I said, you could frame it, run this by the company you work for, but you could frame it as like, hey, we do have a setup cost. That's why we require 20% down. But with the rest of the payment, we could with the rest of the payment plan, we can move into month to month, weekly, or bi-weekly, right? So that's one way to like get that 20 to 30%. But you should make it your personal standard to collect that. All right, moving into the next metric. All right, so we have reschedules and cancels. All right, so reschedule rate equals calls successfully rescheduled. Okay, so the calls that you were able to successfully get back on the books divided by the total number of calls that canceled or requested to reschedule. Okay, we're going to take that number, multiply that by 100. That will get us our reschedule rate. All right, the KPI here is 50%. Okay, so 50%, we want 50% of all cancellations or reschedules to get back on the books. Now, this is another one of those metrics, just like 24-hour turnaround time. This is another one of those metrics that will increase your show rate, right? Higher show rate, more opportunity, which more opportunity is going to equal a higher close rate. Higher close rate equals more money for the business. More money for the business equals more money for you. Okay, so all works in unison. All right, if you have a lot of reschedules and cancellations, it could reflect the time of year, right? In this case, really focus on your 24-hour turnaround time and push the prospect to get booked in under 48 hours, right? So like I said, sometimes in that B2C sales, sometimes there's cycles to things, right? Kids are going back to school, the holidays, right? So sometimes there could be a lot of reschedules and cancellations because of the time of year. And the focus there is like, all right, we got to really focus on getting calls booked within that 24 to 48 hour window, right? It can also reflect lead quality, right? Which once again, we've talked about, always provide that feedback to the company. It could be a reflection of turnaround time. The farther calls are out, the more likely they're going to reschedule. And that's not necessarily that's slightly different than time of year. It could just be like you notice that the booking team is booking you far out. And if that's the case, it's as simple as having a conversation of saying, hey, make sure you book my as soon as possible availability. And the last thing it could be is fear, right? A lot of times people will reschedule or cancel because they're fearful, to which at that point, right, like we could try to pull that out of them if we feel confident doing so via text. Just like, hey, I know you're rescheduled. Like, just want to make sure, like, is there any fear, holding you back from getting on the call? Or is this simply just like some sort of time lapse or whatever, right? And we provided all the scripts in the limbo section that teach you how to handle that. Okay. Um, let's see. Yes. So other things we could do, right? If this reschedule metric is low, is we can make sure that all hands are on deck, meaning that you and the DMer and setter are messaging the limbo section, right? So it's really imperative that we can attack these limbo leads at multiple angles, right? Like you as the high ticket closer should obviously be following up with your own limbo leads, but you can even coordinate with the DMer and setter, the person who originally booked the call for you, and just say, hey, would you mind reaching out to them in the original platform? Like, would you just mind reaching out to them and seeing if we can get them booked, right? And then they can go, let's say, for example, the call is booked in the DMs. They can go back into the DMs and try to get them rebooked as you're like texting the lead and trying to get them rebooked, right? Another thing we can do is obviously put them in the nurture process that we taught in the nurture module. All right, y'all. Those are all the metrics that are important to you as a high ticket closer. Okay. So going over this at a really high level, just once more. All right. Discovery call, show rate, conversion rate. All right. Calls scheduled. How many calls are you getting booked at the top of the funnel? Right. 24-hour turnaround time. How many of those calls are getting turned over in 24 hours? 50% is what we're looking for there. Calls shown. We want 60% of the calls booked to actually show, bare minimum. All right, calls offered or otherwise known as pitched. Of the calls that show, we want to pitch at least 90% of those. Okay, calls closed. Of the calls that show, we want 30 to 35% to close. Okay, contracted, right? No metric there. Obviously, just the higher the better. Collected, right? We want to collect 35% of the contracted within a 30-day period. Okay, reschedules and cancellations. We want 50% of all cancellations and reschedules to get back on the books. I believe that is all, y'all. Yes, it is. Okay, so obviously we're tracking a lot of these metrics on the projection sheet. There's a few metrics on here that are not on the projection sheet. You could, like, 24-hour turnaround time is one, for example. Like, feel free to add that to your own personal projection sheet, or it's just something that you can, like, when you see show rate is low, right, that you can go in and try to figure out what the 24-hour turnaround time is. Okay, so I'm not saying like you need to be tracking the 24-hour turnaround time or any of these metrics that are not on the projection sheet regularly. The ones that are on the projection sheet are the ones that you should be tracking regularly. But these are just some extra metrics that if you want to track daily, you can. Or if you notice things are not going well, you can go in and try to figure out what those metrics are.